The Vietnam War is a term today synonymous with the United States' decade-long conflict there in the 1960s and 70s. But nearly 20 years before the first US combat troops stepped foot in Southeast Asia, another war in Vietnam began, as communist forces rose on the streets of Hanoi to start an all-out struggle against French rule. It was a struggle that would last for 7 years and be every bit as brutal as the American War to come. Prior to the Second World War, the area containing modern-day Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam was ruled by France as one territory, Indochina. French overlordship had been secure in this region for decades, but it faltered in 1940. After France fell to Germany in June of that year, Japanese troops occupied Indochina with the nominal permission of the new Vichy regime. As a result, French authority in the Far East was steadily eroded away, and then destroyed completely in March 1945, when the Japanese dissolved the French colonial administration under Admiral Jean de Coup by force and imprisoned all French personnel in the region. This destruction of French colonial rule left a power vacuum in Indochina when the Japanese then went on to surrender to the Allies in August 1945. This was filled by a variety of nationalist and religious groups, most powerful among them the communist Viet Minh, which had spent the previous year conducting guerrilla operations against the Japanese with US support. As 40,000 Japanese troops awaited disarmament and repatriation, and French troops continued to languish in prison camps, it was the Viet Minh that emerged from the highlands to seize Hanoi, Saigon and other key locations and force a pro-Japanese puppet regime based at Hue to resign. On September 2nd, Ho Chi Minh stood in a Hanoi square and proclaimed the creation of a new independent democratic republic of Vietnam, with himself as its president. Ho did so with the tacit support of the US, whose agents allowed themselves to be photographed saluting the flag of the new Vietnamese state alongside the commander of its army, Vo Nguyen Giap. This was the situation that greeted Allied troops as they began to arrive in Indochina in late 1945 to disarm the Japanese troops there. Responsibility for this process was given to Britain in the south of the region and to nationalist China in the north. Waiting in the wings was France, which saw itself as being entitled to resume its colonial governance of Indochina now that the war was over. Britain, with its own colonies to retake, was happy to assist with a return to the pre-war status quo, and after its troops under General Douglas Gracey flew into Saigon in mid-September, they quickly freed French forces there from Japanese captivity, enabling them to seize the city from the Provisional Vietnamese government. Over the next few months, the two Allied powers fought to expand French control over southern Vietnam. The French shipped in increasing numbers of troops for this purpose, but the British were reluctant to get too stuck in directly. The new Labour government in the UK was not keen that British troops should fight and die for French colonialism, so Gracey filled the gaps in combat by deciding that instead Japanese troops would fight and die for French colonialism, and ordered them to fight the Viet Minh under British command. Though some Japanese actually defected to the Viet Minh rather than fight against them, the vast majority, keen to be allowed to return to Japan, did as they were asked. By January 1946, most of southern Indochina was again under French control, at a cost of 3 British, 37 Indian, 106 French and 110 Japanese lives, with 3,026 casualties on the Vietnamese side. Their work completed, the British promptly sent all of the remaining Japanese troops home and then withdrew in March, handing Indochina over to the new French High Commissioner, Thierry Dagenlu, without so much as a backwards glance. But though one half of the Allied coalition had gone home, in the north of the country, nationalist China kept its 100,000-strong army of occupation very much in place. China, having seen the violence that the resumption of French rule in the south had brought, was not keen on the same happening in the north of the country, bringing instability right to its southern border. Much to the relief of Ho Chi Minh's new state, the Chinese therefore blocked French troops from returning immediately to the north. Unwilling to risk a war with China and under significant pressure from them, France therefore had little alternative but to engage with the DRV diplomatically in the hopes of persuading them to accept French overlordship. An initial agreement was reached on March 6, 1946, in which France acknowledged the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a free state, able to control its own economy and maintain its own standing army, but still within the wider French Union, with ultimate decision-making on some key areas resting in Paris. In return, Ho Chi Minh's government allowed the stationing of a maximum of 15,000 French troops in northern Vietnam. After this point, in towns and cities across the area, French and Vietnamese troops would lead an uneasy coexistence, with each claiming ultimate sovereignty. A further agreement followed in September, which committed both sides to a ceasefire in the south of the country, where a guerrilla war had raged between the Viet Minh and French authorities for months. This agreement was enough to satisfy the Chinese that peace had finally been cemented, and they withdrew their last troops from Vietnam on September 18th. As the agreed ceasefire arrived at the end of October, initially it held. But within a week, both sides were complaining about local breaches all over the south, and the French were starting to get cold feet. The problem was that the ceasefire deprived the French of one of their key advantages now that the Chinese had left: superior military power. It levelled the political playing field, allowing Viet Minh guerrillas to infiltrate new villages and increase their political influence virtually unchecked. In the north of the country as well, relations between the Vietnamese and French governments were becoming more tense. In mid-October, shortly before the ceasefire came into force, the French had begun to levy their own import and export tariffs at the critical port of Haiphong near Hanoi. The French authorities also introduced measures to ban the export of rice and created a list of goods it was prohibited to import to northern Vietnam, including gasoline. Ostensibly this was to prevent a famine, but really it was about hurting the DRV's military. Rice was a key commodity the Vietnamese could use to pay for weapons, and fuel was essential. Stein Tønnesson described French policy by this stage as halting supplies for the Vietnamese army, undermining the economic foundations of the Vietnamese state, and provoking the Vietnamese government to either submit to French will or react forcibly. In November, the French showed no signs of relinquishing these tariffs, which the DRV viewed as a pretty flagrant breach of the agreement that had led to the ceasefire. Ho Chi Minh's government protested, and the two sides became increasingly antagonistic towards each other. And just as relations were reaching crisis point, Dargenliu was summoned back to Paris for discussions with the government, leaving Indochina in the hands of General Jean Valluy as acting High Commissioner. Just days later, tensions finally boiled over at Haiphong. On the morning of November 20th, a Chinese ship arrived and began to offload gasoline. French troops quickly seized it and its cargo, but they were then overpowered and seized themselves by a larger Vietnamese force after a brief gun battle. In response, the local French commander, Colonel Pierre Deb, rolled armoured vehicles into the town, exchanging cannon and machine gun fire with Vietnamese soldiers as they went and seizing the opera house as a base. After a standoff of several hours, the French general in Hanoi, Louis Molière, was able to broker a ceasefire between the two sides. But General Valluy then overruled him from Saigon, ordering Colonel Deb to take full control of Haiphong by force, proclaiming, "The moment has come to teach those who have treacherously attacked us a severe lesson. By all the means at your disposal, you must gain complete control of Haiphong and make the Vietnamese army and government regret their mistakes." At 10:05 on November 23rd, Deb attacked with his full force, using artillery and naval gunfire support. The French troops quickly smashed all opposition, while thousands of civilians and Vietnamese fighters fled the town, where they were strafed on the roads by French aircraft. By the day's end, Haiphong was in French hands at a large cost to the town's population. Estimates of casualties range widely, but were certainly in the thousands. The massacre at Haiphong pushed Indochina decisively towards open warfare. 3 weeks later, fighting broke out on the streets of Hanoi, as Viet Minh forces assaulted French positions there just after 8 p.m. on December 19th and overran much of the city. A French counterattack began at 9:30, clearing much of the city and capturing the presidential palace at 4 p.m. on the 20th. By the end of the month, only the old Chinese quarter remained in Vietnamese hands, with fighters dug in amongst the narrow streets. An initial attempt to pierce this fortress was pushed back on December 27th, so General Moyet decided to impose a blockade rather than storming it with artillery and the inevitable heavy cost in lives. He then agreed to a ceasefire brokered by the Chinese consul in Hanoi in January 1947, allowing for the evacuation of thousands of civilians who had been trapped when the fighting began. This ceasefire ended on February 1st, 1947, which was also the end of Molière's tenure commanding French troops in northern Vietnam. His replacement was none other than Colonel Pierre Deb, who preferred a more vigorous application of force to Molière. As soon as the truce expired, Deb sent in his troops to begin a painstaking house-clearing operation. Arrayed against the French were 1,000 or so Vietnamese fighters who still remained. These were not regular trained forces. Giap had long since withdrawn all of those to save them from destruction, but militia, who had been charged with fighting a futile battle for political purposes, supported by a 175-strong children's guard of 12 to 14-year-olds acting as messengers and scouts, and who were inevitably caught up in the fighting. The French troops used artillery, airstrikes, tanks and bulldozers in prodigious quantities, reducing the old quarter to rubble for almost 3 weeks, until the militia was finally forced to give up their positions on February 18th and retreat across the Dumer Bridge. After 2 months, 1,000 French and 5,000 Vietnamese casualties had been suffered. The battle for Hanoi was now over, but the battle for Vietnam, and indeed for the whole of Indochina, was only just beginning. Ho Chi Minh and his army had escaped to the highlands, from where they could launch the start of a 7-year war for the future of Southeast Asia.